I would like for all of us to believe in nonviolence, but I'm here to say tonight that if every Negro in the United States turns against nonviolence, I'm going to stand up as a lone voice and say this is the wrong way.
Good morning. This is Dr. Mark Whitlock with Reed Temple. Excited about this Martin Luther King weekend where we celebrate our dreamer, our civil rights guru, our emancipator, our man that believes that having faith in God changes the world. You know who I'm talking about, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And as we celebrate his life and his legacy and the call to action, we also want to celebrate Dr. Rayshawn Ray. Dr. Rayshawn Ray, my good alpha brother, who put this program together. Thank you, Dr. Rayshawn Ray, Brookings Institute, a national speaker dealing with police reform. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Push Coalition, partnering certainly with Dr. Todd Geary. Thank you, Dr. Jamie Riley. Thank you, Sister Juanica Fisher. We look forward to not only listening and hearing what they have to say about as we deal with the challenge of voter rights, voter registration, voter emancipation, as we deal with police reform, as we look at the challenges of food deserts and the real problem that has been uncovered as a result of the absence of good health care within the African American community. We must not just be hearers, but we must be doers. We look forward to a great program as we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Stay tuned. God bless.
I will never change in my basic idea that nonviolence is the most potent weapon available to the Negro in his struggle for freedom and justice. I think for the Negro to turn to violence would be both impractical and immoral. I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the economic plight of the Negro poor has worsened. Well, I would say this, we don't have long. The mood of the Negro community now is one of urgency, one of saying that we aren't going to wait, that we've got to have our freedom. We've waited too long.
happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Because I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. Not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
The last year of Dr. King's life, full of excitement and drama. The Vietnam War was still raging. 55,000 Americans killed in that war, 3 million Vietnamese, and Dr. King protested that war. April 4th, 1967, he spoke in Riverside Church on that night why he said the reason why he was against the Vietnam War. The Pope's campaign was also part of his agenda. But we had the public accommodation, we had the right to vote, but many people poor, working poor people. Well, after such a long day, discussing so many different subjects, the Vietnam War report, those who demonstrated, who broke the demonstration the day before, were throwing rocks, meeting with them and their demands. And it began to rain. He was very tired. He said, I think I don't want to go tonight. Jesse, will you go for me? I said, well, Doc, I'd like to go. I don't have a word to say. I don't have a word tonight. He should go in the house. Well, Doc, let me think about it. So I'll go. I can't go by myself. He asked Ralph, Ralph, will you go? Yes, I'll go with him. So we left the hotel. Dr. King was lying in bed, and got to the Merchant Temple. It was raining, but the tents out rough in the place. You could hear the rain falling. About 2,000 people in the place. Sees 8,000 people. About 1/4 full. We walked in. People started shouting. They saw rapping out there. Some Dr. King was with us. The Abner said, "Yes, sir." They're not cheering for us. They're cheering for Dr. King. I think he's with us, but he's not. So we went inside the church, Bishop Mason's tomb, to the pay telephone, and we dialed the number. And said, Dr. King, you don't feel well. If you just come to show your face, just to show your face, you don't have to say much. They want to see you so badly. Your presence is a kind of healing. So the King came, Ralph gave him a long introduction, trying to use up some space and time. The King got about a single note, was the whole speech been a mountaintop, and he's seen the promised land. And when I get there, we can see another Dr. King on the scene. We try to capture his spirit. It's the best we could do. and try to catch his vision. His vision was a populist campaign, a summer faithful kind of rainbow coalition of effect. And at the bottom, there are more people than at the top. And it's not about skin color, it's about particular people they're in. So the voting rights was such a big deal. All major cities in Alabama have black mayors now. That was his father's dream. He very friendly stuff in the mountaintop. You know, when the king owned Dr. King real hard at that time, and he couldn't raise any money. So Belafonte and Aretha Franklin did an 11-city tour out Seattle, going right around. Only one made money was Chicago. We had an organization here with Brett Bass at that time. Dr. King hit the stage in Houston, Texas, and he stepped on the stage to give Aretha some flowers. And when Dr. King began to give his remarks to Aretha, they put gas in the fan where they evacuated the building. Aretha was a trooper. She sang the next night. It's like nothing had happened. I mean, we hung in there. It is that I think as we celebrate his birthday, what did he have? He said, Dr. King talked about those values. If we have a rainbow, we organize the Southern Voter Crusade again. And for South, for the ratio of blacks and whites in the South is close. That's why it's been so tense in the South. Because blacks, in fact, can run for governor, 6 years doing in Georgia. Blacks can run for governor in Virginia 1, as Doug Wilder did. Across the South, if black run for a solid Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, who have those kind of numbers. Given the big ball game this year, the national championship between Georgia and Alabama, our children on the field fill the stadiums. And those young men in a uniform are applauded and dressed and put on their civic clothes. They're beaten down. Can't be pulling off our children for a touchdown to make you happy one night, be against their parents having basic jobs and decency the next day. So we get a lot of possibilities, a lot of confusion. I'm excited about the prospects now, where we are today. We're ready to protest another war. War drums are always beating, it seems. We're trying to register and vote in mass with record levels of excitement, top down and bottom up. Biden's taking a hit right now, but I tell you, Biden has done quite a job. His ambition was to have a bigger economic package, and one Senator Manson blocked it. And the senator from Arizona, they blocked it. And the role they're playing is beyond imagination to me. So now the Voting Rights Act is out now on one issue. The right to vote procedure, the right to vote, everything else flows. That we've lost everything. So we're putting all the stops out. Some are boycotting, some marching. Joe Madison is fasting to death. At the point of death, he's willing to fast to get the Voting Rights Act. So there'll be a lot of pressure on Biden and on Democrats and Republicans. Strom Thurmond was in the Voting Rights Act 25 years ago. George Wallace and that group did the same thing. Now you have a group of ideologues in Washington that are so set on anti-Trump and anti-progress, they're willing to cut their own necks and wreck our democracy, just to be mean as hell. So we're fighting back. And I tell you, when I think about Dr. King, I don't talk about that very much as depression, because the ending is so tragic. I don't like to talk about it, but I have to talk about it to explain what happened. His spirit was build a coalition, engage in direct action. There's nothing more powerful than put the power of marching feet for the righteous cause. And he believed in mass marches. The fact is, we've not gotten any progress from riots or from staying home with justice. We've always gotten progress when there was mass action. Also, in 100 big major cities, we're going to build economic fortresses. We'll take 100, say in Atlanta or Chicago, 100 major businesses, and do a social audit on them. Look at the board of directors, their C-seats, use of black professionals in goods and services. So we're fighting the political and economic movement today. We thank God to Dr. King so much. He laid the way. We must follow that way. Thank you.
Reed Temple, we just heard a very powerful set of remarks from Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. We really appreciate him joining us for this event. Obviously, we also thank Pastor Dr. Mark Whitlock for his opening remarks, as well as for the production team and everyone who's played a role in putting this event on. As we think about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., In 1957, MLK said, "Give us the ballot." 55 years later, African Americans are still fighting for equitable voting rights. This event is focusing on the lasting legacy of MLK, thinking about what we have to do to ensure that voting rights are fully in place for everyone, as well as our pursuit of racial justice more broadly. So joining me is a very esteemed group of panelists. You all are really in for a treat. I want to bring them up one by one as I introduce them. First, Wanika Fisher, who is a delegate for the state of Maryland in the House of Delegates, District 47B, right here in Prince George's County. She is also the assistant majority leader, meaning that she is essentially the highest ranking new delegate in the House of Delegates. That is a very, very big deal and a big honor. And we definitely take pride in the fact that she is not only in our county, but also a graduate of the University of Maryland, where I happen to be a professor at. Delegate Fisher was born in New York. She is the daughter of Nigerian and South African immigrants. And part of thinking about the work that she's done is pursuing reparations in the state of Maryland. I'm pretty sure that's something that she'll be talking about as she is going into a new legislative session. Next up, Dr. Jamie Riley. Dr. Riley is the Director of Race and Justice at the NAACP. Previously, he led his own diversity and strategic planning and consulting firm, engaging in a series of activities that were important for racial justice. Previously to that, Dr. Riley served as the Assistant Vice President for Student Life and Dean of Students at the University of Alabama, where he was the first African American to hold that position. Prior to that role at the University of Alabama, Dr. Riley served as the Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer for Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, located primarily in Baltimore, Maryland. And finally, and definitely with no to do, Dr. Todd Yeary, who serves as senior pastor for Douglas Memorial Community Church and is also an adjunct professor in the College of Public Affairs at the University of Baltimore. He is also serving as the CEO of Rainbow Push, and I'm so excited to have all of these panelists here today. So, Delegate Fisher, I actually want to start with you and then open this question up to everyone. We know that we are in a moment in time that is quite difficult for everyone as we grapple with the never-ending COVID-19 pandemic, a continuous pursuit for equitable voting rights, and failed police reform at the federal level, even though, as I'm sure you and others might note, in the state of Maryland, it's been a bit different. But accordingly, thinking about this MLK Day, what MLK quote do you think most speaks to the current times?
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here. I would say this question was hard because there's so many quotes and almost all of them apply. But the one that came to my mind, I just kept coming back to over and over, is the one that says, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. And I will say my term in the legislature and everything that you talked about, COVID-19, vaccine and health access issues, police reform to our economy. This is the time where we need people to stand up and meet these challenges and not sink into their comfort and convenience of their own community or their own thoughts. And it's a time to push ourselves to do more, to be more creative. If someone had to ask me, would I be standing at a mega mart in my term of office, pulling people out of cars to get the vaccine? I mean, just the things that I've just even personally experienced are beyond what I thought my comfort and convenience were going to be in representing people. And I think all of us need to push ourselves and really reimagine what service and community is going to look like. The fact that we're just all on here on a digital platform just speaks volumes to where we are. And that's really the quote that I kept coming back to.
So well said. Dr. Riley, what about you? I mean, thinking about the work that you've done at Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, which I myself happen to be a member of, as well as others here, and thinking about the fact that Dr. King was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, all the work that you've done over the years, what quote stands out to you that would help people think about this particular moment in time?
I mean, exactly like Delegate Fisher said, I mean, there are so many that are applicable to what we're experiencing. If I had to pick one, it would be if you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. But by all means, keep moving. And I think that is very reflective, not only of what we're experiencing in this public health and economic pandemic, because for Black folks, we've been in a racial pandemic since we were kidnapped and brought to this land, but it represents the need that we are the centers of our own liberation. And I think that Dr. King's work and efforts really centered and prioritized that we cannot wait on others to move the needle for us or to create equity. We must foster it and demand it ourselves. Now, there's strategy, which I know we'll talk about more in the conversation. There's approaches, there's tactics to that, but we have to keep on moving. And we cannot allow some of the disparities and disenfranchisements that we continue to experience to limit our work to ensure that we have policy and efforts that meet the needs of our community. So I think that's the one. I could go on and on his quotes, but that's the one I think that stuck out most for me.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely one of my favorite quotes and so powerful right now as we think about, unfortunately, so many people just simply trying to survive. They are literally crawling. And I mean, MLK throughout his career, throughout his life, gave us so many nuggets. Dr. Yuri, what about you? I mean, you have a keen insight on this particular topic, especially considering your relationship with Reverend Jesse Jackson, probably some things that people have never heard and seen. What stands out to you? What quote kind of magnifies this moment from MLK for you?
Well, first, thanks, Dr. Ray, for convening all of us to have this important conversation. I think the quote is juxtaposed with an image. I had a midlife crisis where I went to law school. It was kind of to pursue a childhood dream long after I had been established as a pastor. And I was older than most of my law school professors. In the course of being admitted to practice law, I applied for admission in of all states, Alabama. When I went down to interview with the Character and Fitness Committee at the Bar Association, when you walk outside the Alabama Bar Association, if you look to your left up the hill, you see two things that stand in contradistinction. The first and most prominent is actually the dome of the Alabama State Capitol at the top of the hill. But diagonally across the street, down the hill, just a little closer in the foreground, is a red brick church known to the world as Dexter Avenue Church. It's the church that Dr. King pastored when he led the Montgomery bus boycott. And while physically the structures stand in contrast to one another, the Capitol dome is more prominent, but that red brick building, that church that he pastored, was more powerful. And this is a moment where we have to recognize that we should not be comparing size, but outcome. And the outcomes have to be tied to power. That being the case, when I consider the quote that Dr. King raises that always reverberates in the back of my mind, even as Delegate Fisher and those are starting up this legislative session, taking up the thousands of bills that are going to come up affecting the lives of folks in Maryland. State houses are doing it across the country. Dr. King stated that we're now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. And then he goes on to say that in this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. And we have to recognize that there is this thing called the fierce urgency of now. Those are the words that ring in my head all the time. Very often when it comes to our issues, they are often put on the back burner. They're often deferred. So whether we're talking about reparations as restitution for economic benefit that has accumulated over time and benefited the government, or if we're talking about even right now, this debate, this lack of commitment to the notion of voting rights, particularly for those who are most disaffected by the process. We got to recognize that we don't have time to put everything on pause. We don't have time, as I'm sitting in the sanctuary of my own church, we don't have time to hold a church meeting, right? The time to meet is long gone. It's time to take it to the streets. And I think that's what we have to learn from Dr. King in this moment, that this is the moment that we've been waiting for.
So well said. I mean, all of these quotes are some of my favorite. I mean, one of my all-time favorite in building on this is when for the March on Washington, he said, "We've come to cash a check marked with insufficient funds." And that is still part of what is happening today, that insufficient funds, as Dr. Yuri was talking, still runs up on this moment. And look, Pastor Yuri, it's fascinating to hear you say that a midlife crisis was going to law school. I think a lot of people would love for that to be their midlife crisis of deciding that I'm going to go get another degree on top of all the other things you've done. But that definitely doesn't surprise me. Dr. Riley, I want to come to you and work my way around in terms of thinking about what should we learn from MLK and the civil rights movement specifically about this current movement for Black lives. I mean, obviously that the civil rights movement becomes one of the biggest comparison points. What should we take away from that movement to give people hope in this particular moment? Because that's one of the things that MLK was great about. He shot it straight, much straighter than the media oftentimes, and even our textbooks would have us to believe. But he also gave people hope, of course, in a very pastorally way. What are the lessons learned from the civil rights movement for this current movement for Black lives?
Absolutely. There's a concept I think about as we think about transformation and shift to equity. And all of us have heard the term of Sankofa, so looking back to move forward. And if we really start there, even before, if we look at 1619 to 1865 to 1964 to 2022, there are generations and centuries and legacy of effort to move equality and really to repair and liberate. In reality, our goal here has not just been racial equity, it's been liberation from the bounds of racism and marginalization. Dr. King and the civil rights movement showed a very strong framework for how that's done. And we need to hold on to that framework. Some of that framework that we realize is that it's strategic yet intentional, that there is always going to be a push and pull between transformation and incremental. And if we look at, again, 1619 to 1865 to 1964, the Civil Rights Act, even what we're going through now with voter suppression, is that although I come from the school of thought of transformation and abolishment, I understand that if I look at it in the name of Sankofa, that a lot of the transformation that we've experienced has been packaged in reform that has been small but mighty. And so, I think that's one thing we have to learn. And it took a lot of effort that was transformational to get the Civil Rights Act and to change not only legislation, but to change the minds, which we're still fighting on now, changing the minds of people about who is considered human, who should have access and opportunity and experience the true rights of this democracy. We learned, during the civil rights, the skill of mobilization. And I think if you layer that now, that there's really a need to be intersectional in that approach. Black people are not a monolith. We all don't think alike and have the same ideas of how to move forward. And that was the same during the civil rights era. There was a lot of debate and tension around the approach, whether it be violent, nonviolent, demand versus collaborate and compromise. But there was a skill to bring everyone along in that process. And I think that's something that as we think about the movement for Black lives, for Black liberation right now, that has to be something, which means that all of our members of our community, regardless of identity, background, have to be part. Their voices and their values and their perspectives have to be part of this. Another thing I'd say in thinking through this is also that policy change is often where we get the biggest transformation. And when we say policy change, it is just not passing legislation, but it is the equitable enactment and implementation of legislation. We can see throughout history that well-meaning legislation can be implemented and be harmful. We look at some of the social safety net programs that we have. We even look at the bipartisan infrastructure law now. There's an opportunity for us to really transform the economic inequities for Black folks if implemented correctly. But policy is that way. And Dr. King showed us that through policy and legislation, we can continue to move transformation. So policy advocacy has to be part of any movement. And then the last thing I'll say is it has to be intergenerational. That's one thing I appreciate about the NAACP, being in the space with young children who are part of youth chapters and units, but also working with members of our community who are 100 years old, still leading committees and units across the country. Dr. King taught us the importance of having an intergenerational approach to transformation. again, that Sankofa looking back to move forward. So, those are some of the things that I think that I know I hold on to, and that when I'm working with folks and doing this work, that I try to make sure that we embody to really get to where we're trying to go, because we still haven't gotten there yet to this day.
Yeah, very well said. Delegate Fisher, I want to come to you. Dr. Riley mentioned policy and eloquently highlighted not just the mandating, but the implementation of policy. I'm curious what you think in this moment as you head into legislative session. What are some of the lessons learned from MLK and the civil rights movement that we should use in this current movement for Black lives?
I think what I've taken from it is to don't stop the pressure. Don't let it be, 148 characters. And I think as I think about this legislative session, and even though I'm very proud and I worked really hard on police reform, and overall I'm proud of Maryland, there's a lot we left out. And I won't go into the details of that here, but there's bills we're bringing back this year to push it further to where we wanted that bill to go. And I think, I keep thinking Black Lives Matter, Black livelihood matters. Mm-hmm. And that's where I'm trying to center my mind around, is not only the legislation that's coming through. I'm a little narrowly focused in our state house, but also I'm thinking about, we have an election that matters in June, in 6 months from now. And the challenges of our current governor here in Maryland, and everything that's happened with COVID, IGN holders not being part of COVID relief. I could just go on and on. You just can't stop the pressure. And just because you got one win that we all agreed upon on police reform, and it's on the ballot either locally, and we want to move want to see more done on a federal level, we have to keep pushing to make ourselves whole. And we're just never going to have this moment again. So I think that's what I keep thinking. And that's what I want to take back to not only my state, but the Black Caucus in the state of Maryland. We're the second largest Black caucus in the country. And so there's a pressure that if Maryland doesn't do it, what state's going to do it? And so I think that's what I'm thinking about. And just being inspired by the three of you and talking to you about this and what we need to do tomorrow on opening day till sign die, is to keep the pressure. And we can't do that alone. I think I would say to the members of Read and for others watching or may see this, is that we need you. As an elected official, it hasn't changed me. It's only, it's only been a couple of years of my life, short life, but a couple of years of it. And just one person doesn't make this stuff happen alone. People think that. I don't know why. We need you rallying in the streets. We need you logging on those Zooms, because I will tell you, the leadership in those chambers and that governor's mansion, they look and they know and they hear about it. And when there's a lack of pressure from the community and from our state, they feel like they can get away with not doing the right thing because nobody's looking. And especially, it could be another whole call. The way media coverage is today, it's very, very difficult. When we talk about just the body camera footage of where we are today and the footage of dogs and hoses in the 60s, right? It's that imagery that changed hearts and minds in America in a big way. And that's why we're here. And the politicians sitting in those seats, the policy and how you want things executed, I can pass anything I want. It's the governor that executes, right? And so all of these things, they require a pressure and accountability that the public and the state have to give. And so, your elected official is only one part of it. When people ask me, why isn't Maryland here? You have so much Black elected representation. That's only one part of the formula. Yeah, we have a seat at the table, but we're still on the menu, and like, we have to figure out how to write what's on the menu instead of being on it. And when it comes to like the money in politics, the lack of accountability, the fact that folks in our community have no idea not only who their elected official is, but what's even going on is hard. But yet people know athletic stats at the drop of a hat. And so it's really, really hard to move us forward. And the one thing I'm reflecting on, and that I'm also learning from MLK and the entire civil rights movement, is look at those movements. People were involved. Knowledge was taken. I mean, never in my life, I'll say this and I'll end here, in Maryland, I had regular citizens know what the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights was. They knew what a piece of legislation meant and how it was affecting their lives, and they could speak to that and wanting to see that repealed, and we did. And so it's not just the movement, it's not the sign, it's the fact that the people are actually aware of what's oppressing them or what's hurting them, and they're communicating that they want to see change on that. And so, we have to be in it together. It wasn't just the Black Caucus and other allies saying we need to repeal LEOBR. It was people in the streets chanting it and putting the name of the statute on a sign that made us, do it. And Maryland was one of the first states to implement. We were the model state to give law enforcement their own set of rights. It's all of these things that really matter, and it takes energy. And for our community, it is hard, because we have other things going on. We have a health crisis going on, an economic crisis going on. It's hard to just take care of your family and then be in the movement. And so we have to have grace, but with it, and ask, God and other, whatever makes you whole out there, to be a part of it. But if we don't do it, it's never going to get done. And it is asking for a lot. It is. But, I need everyone on this call to be engaged to move us forward. And so that's what I've gotten out of it and been reflecting on.
Powerful. I mean, knowledge is powerful. I mean, you quoted the late, great John Lewis, of course, who did a lot of his work during the civil rights movement in Tennessee, where Dr. Riley and I spent a lot of our years early on. And you also spoke to applying pressure. When I think about pressure, there isn't hardly too many more people that apply pressure in so many different ways than Pastor Yuri. And thinking about this pressure politically in terms of legislation, organizationally in all the organizations that he runs, of course, being a pastor. And so, Dr. Yuri, I'm curious from you, what are the lessons for this movement at this moment, so that we can ensure, as Delegate Fisher said, that we aren't simply just sitting at the table, right? We brought up the folding chair that Shirley Chisholm told us to do, and now we're sitting at the table. But even though we're sitting at the table, as John Lewis and Delegate Fisher said, now all of a sudden we're just being served up. We're not able to pick out the groceries and actually do some of the things that we know needs to be done. What are the lessons learned for this moment for applying that pressure and getting things done?
Well, first, thank you for your generosity. I would suggest that we go back and take all that we've heard from Delegate Fisher and Dr. Riley and really take it to heart. There is this linkage. Faith and justice go together. This is a conversation within the context of Reed Temple African Methodist Episcopal Church. Most of you, I don't even know if you know this, Dr. Ray. My first ordination is AME. I was ordained in the Chicago Annual Conference of the 4th District. To understand the story of Richard Allen and the call for human dignity at a moment of sacred engagement is kind of part of the Sankofa that we carry around with us. We have to have an active historical memory in the age and the time when there's this debate that somehow or other critical race theory is anything other than the accurate telling and teaching of America's history. The reason they're having this argument is because Nicole Hannah-Jones, in her Courage, wrote the 1619 Project just to even skim the surface, just to make folks a little uncomfortable. We all know that it could have gone much deeper than it did, but very often it is that sense of disturbing the comfort zone of those who would consider themselves to be white allies that we have to make sure remains active. That's why Dr. King had to write a letter from Birmingham jail, because they made this issue of justice a Black folks issue. The issue of equity and restitution and reparations, well, that's Black folks' problem. No, it's a historical problem that's tied to the nation's identity. And when we study civil rights acts, the first one we all study is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was the first one that was passed post-Civil War, and then look at just how much effort was put into making sure that what was committed to in that piece of legislation would never come to fruition. Right after that, less than a decade later, you have the civil rights cases where you begin to see the erosion. We just recently in Louisiana had the posthumous pardoning of Homer Adolph Plessy, who was a Black man who could pass in the in the reading of the ruling of his case. He was 7/8 Caucasian, 1/8 African blood, but he was proud enough to know he had economic wherewithal to buy a first-class ticket on an intrastate train to decide that he was going to sit in first-class seating and not take second-class status. We've got to make sure that even if they never put it on the agenda in public education curricula, churches have to be the first educational framework and classroom for the teaching of liberation for our people. That's number one. The second thing is I'm a Hamilton fan. The theme that when legislative session opens, the soundtrack that plays in my head is the room where it happens. Too often, we don't show up in the room where it happens. We like to show up maybe once every 4 years, if that, if we're going to vote. The numbers are very troubling when it's not a presidential election that gets a lot of attention. So we don't look at who's passing the local budget. We don't pay attention to what's happening in state budgets. State budgets represent $1 trillion of economic placement every single session, not just the $1.9 trillion that the Biden-Harris administration put on the street shortly after taking office, that we still don't know how are local governments and state governments going to distribute those funds to make sure that equity is foundational to the deployment of federally appropriated funds. And so we have to recognize that in this moment, Dr. King showed us that this is really a continuation. He inherited a mantle of trying to continue the cause and the call for justice. Remember, the Montgomery bus boycott was 100 years after the Dred Scott decision. We have to make sure that we never lose sight, Sankofa, looking back at what? Looking back and never forgetting that we are the heirs to this generation's work. We're not new to, we're not the ones that are creating this whole swell of a movement. It's in our blood. It goes back to the holds of the ships when our ancestors were held captive and stacked like sardines. And so part of this is coming back with this sense of what I will call a cultural pride. That's what Kwanzaa is, right? We go through the capitalism of the holiday season, but then we spend the next 7 days between Christmas and New Year's focusing on the cultural commitments we make as Africans in America. Something about this has to be a linkage between what Micah says, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God, and then what James Brown says, that public theologian of our history, who says, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. And so at some point, we've got to make sure that when we show up in the room where it happens, first thing folks are going to see is your presence. Y'all know what presence is. They're going to see your face before they hear your voice. But then when it's time to open up the mic, it's got to be open mic night. Delegate Fisher was real clear. They're having virtual hearings all session in the House of Delegates. They're starting out with virtual hearings in the Senate, may at some point go to in-person, depending on what happens with COVID. We got to be ready to track the issues, because guess what? The legislative session is about addressing interest. And the first interest, the mandatory interest of the legislative session in Maryland is the legislature must pass. The only piece of legislation they must pass is the state budget, which is the quantifying of interest using public funds. And if we don't show up in the room where it happens, that's not putting you on the menu. You don't even get menu status. You become the supply. You're the inventory that makes someone else's menu go.
Somebody ends up beating you for lunch. You better preach, Pastor Yeary. You better preach. I want to come right back to you and ask you a question about the role of the church at this moment. It's difficult for people to come together. As you just noted, in legislative areas across the country, people are engaging in virtual sessions. Kids are virtual, having a difficult time grappling with what's going on. One of the things that the church always has done is build community, and it's become difficult for them to build community in this particular moment. As you sit in your church, what is the role of the church at this moment? What should the church be doing to play a role in the things that we're discussing right now and help people to thrive and not simply survive during a pandemic, during the movement for Black lives, during all of the things that we know are happening in our society?
Well, the first thing the church has to do, our first calling, is to always protect life. In the midst of a pandemic, we've got to make sure that our people not only survive the pandemic. If we go all the way back, remember when this first started, you couldn't get a test unless you could get a doctor's appointment. and you couldn't get a doctor's appointment if you couldn't be seen in person. And one of the first things they shut down in Baltimore City was access to public transit. Then they went to telehealth, telemedicine, before they had worked out the digital divide, which was already a big problem before COVID. And so part of this has been we've had to protect the interest and the lives of people literally as we have tried to overcome this pandemic, even with education and the difficulty with distance learning, and the fact that parents needing to go to work and the childcare issues that made it hard to have someone there, the already persistent gaps with adult learning, where we have a high functional level of what is often called illiteracy, right? Not being able to really understand what our kids are learning. And so the church has been that place where we protected lives, we protected and affirmed dignity. We didn't put nobody on blast. The person who had no degree, no high school education, had the same status, rank, and opportunity to serve in the presence of God as the most educated. This is the level. This is the level where our people come together. But the other thing is the church has to have a convening responsibility. This is the place where the stuff that affects us has to be talked about. This becomes the table where the family sits down to talk about family business, if you will, to come up with the strategy about how we're going to move forward. And it's not so much, we got, I think, sidetracked for probably 20, 30 years from the mid to late 80s up until probably the mid 2010s on this notion of creating a more capital-focused enterprise called the church. We started taking prosperity gospel and detaching it from justice. And I ain't saying you're supposed to be prosperous, but the Bible says, I want you to prosper even as your soul prospers. And so there's nothing worse than having a big bank account and a soul bound for hell and a community that's falling through the cracks in the process of calling ourselves really committed to this cause and call of justice. And so what the church has to be is we have to be radical challengers of the status quo. Granted, we want to protect the health and safety of our communities, but at the same time, we have to be willing to do what's going to push the envelope. Dr. King didn't lead a bus boycott because it was popular and convenient. That certainly wasn't top on his list. And anybody that's ever been to seminary, they don't give you a class saying, if you want to be a reputable preacher, this is how you do it. You go find, no, trouble comes with hazards. And these are troubling times. Delegate Fisher is talking about raising an issue of reparations. First of all, the word makes white folks break out in a rash. They don't even understand what the definition is. And so I often have to change it and put it in a legal term. It's restitution. You are actually putting us in the place, and she said it, making us whole. Where would we have been had you not had a 2-century head start on denying our people the economic opportunity? Because at the end of the day, it's not because we can't be competitive. It's not that we don't have collective and community genius. It's not that we don't have passion to make sure that everybody can thrive. It is that we are often asked to run a race with a boulder tied around our legs, and many times it's tied to our legs by a shackle that capitalizes in the criminal justice system that makes it hard. And while the governor, let me just go on and put this tag out here, I'll give Delegate Fisher a little fuel, while he's talking about his crime plan that he's trying to bring back, let us not forget that criminal justice reform he tried to take credit for at the beginning of his first term, which was a big issue that session because I was the political action chair of the NAACP state conference at that time. I was in the room. But I also recognize that when we were talking about equity for HBCUs, this governor said that quantified value, a reasonable number for equity with HBCUs, was not more than $200 million. But yet when the General Assembly challenged him on it, when they got tired of playing games in the Fourth Circuit, running the risk that this might end up before this Supreme Court that would likely unravel it, the General Assembly, those whom we elect, had the courage to say, we're going to put it in legislation and we're going to override the governor's veto. And he didn't even let it go through an override. When it got passed with such numbers, guess what he did? When that $500 million piece of legislation came in, he showed up skin and grinning with a pen in his hand, ready to sign the piece of paper to act like he had something to do with it. At the end of the day, we got to remember, bring your faith, but don't lose your hustle instinct. bring your spidey senses with you and understand that sometimes you got to play this game with a little of the street that the Lord delivered you from, that you're subject to go back to. At the end of the day, I'm saved, but I'm a sinner saved by grace. The Lord's still working on me, and I have to make sure I'm not subject to a relapse in the course of dealing with folks who's trying to hustle me and my people. So at the end of the day, I'm going to say, praise the Lord, everybody, but I'm going to end the day saying, don't start nothing, won't be nothing.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Now, this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
What I want to do, I want to go to Delegate Fisher now, because you mentioned so many things about the state of Maryland. So I want to go to Delegate Fisher now and ask her a specific question. Then Dr. Riley, I'm going to come back to you. And in both of you all's responses to these next questions, I also want you all to integrate the role of the church and how we think about the work that you all are doing. So Delegate Fisher, there's always this focus on federal legislation, but Dr. Yeary just took us here to Maryland as we think about the start of this legislative session. Of course, you all have been highlighting everything from reparations to the Maryland Police Accountability Act, which Dr. Yeary played a big role in, which obviously you did. And I was honored to testify on some of that legislation. What are some of the things that people in the state of Maryland should be focusing on? Because as you noted, the state of Maryland is not only the most affluent black area, has the most affluent black county in the United States, but also has a huge political representation in the State House in Annapolis. Oftentimes what happens in Maryland, people feel as though they can do it elsewhere. So what are some of the things happening that's coming up that people should be paying attention to, that people should join those virtual sessions, that people should email their House of Delegates, their state senators, and other individuals? What are some of the things that people should be focusing on to apply the pressure right now?
Yeah, there's so much. I could take an hour, but I'll highlight the highlights. And Dr. Yeary, you've got me like all pumped up, ready to go. I'm gonna need to talk to you like every day of this 90 days. But obviously we talked about reparations or restitution, and so I will be reintroducing the Harriet Tubman Community Investment Act to actually start a work group, to start a process. We're the state of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. Our state archives does a great job. There's no reason that Maryland is letting small municipalities like in Easton, Illinois, lead on reparations, and we're not. So I'm really excited. And I will say there's definitely been progress with our speaker on this topic. And I'm really excited for the movement of that. I'm sure you all have heard about the legalization of cannabis, and it might be a referendum to the ballot. And, thinking that you can fix the details after you legalize it is just totally wrong. And let me just be on record to folks watching and the community that that's not how it works. Rushing it to a referendum, not saying that we don't want to also lead, and Maryland's getting a lot of pressure because Virginia moved forward, but we want to make sure the Black community is made whole from the incarceration of Black men on cannabis and weed, right? Something that I even talk about that I have to push the judiciary is I want in the bill automatic expungement, not just for use for it to sell. Who's to say my brother wasn't going to get a license, right? I want all of it automatically expunged, and the individual does not have to do any paperwork. The state will clear your record by a certain date. We do have some technological difficulties with it, but we can put in there by 2035. Everyone's record should be clear. And then for those with immigrant status, sometimes they don't want that. There's a technicality I can go to on immigration law. they have to put a form in with a check that says, please don't automatically expunge my records, and they can go do that themselves, right? That you submit that to the court. There's ways to get this done. There's ways to make sure that Black businesses in the license scheme for legalization of cannabis are going to be competitive and be a part of that new economy here in Maryland. Sports betting, I'm sure you just put on to your TV or YouTube, you're seeing, I think there's a commercial with Halle Berry I saw about sports betting recently. So sports betting is huge. But if you can bet on our men's bodies, how come our men and women aren't owning the companies that you can bet with? That's the question I have. What is sports betting? It's betting on Black men's bodies and their performance. That's what it is. And so I know that the leadership, so that committee goes, that bills in ways and means, contacting our representatives in ways and means to make sure that we have a piece of the pie when sports betting is meant to fruition. And that's why I will say, people are always like, why is Maryland so slow with this stuff? Because you got a Black caucus that's looking out for you. That's why it's slow. And that's why we can't get it done, because we're arguing, because we want it to be right, just not out there for the MGMs and the big companies to just get all the license and eat up the little guys, and then we're done. And then once the genie's out, you can't put it back in. So I would say sports betting is a huge one to pay attention to. As you probably all know, redistricting, right? You did the census. We voted on congressional maps in December. And now we're going to be voting in the next couple of weeks on your state legislative maps, the way each state district looks. That's really important in that the Black caucus has gotten gains in seats. Myself, I was a gain in seats. My seat has not been held by someone African-American, believe it or not. Seats like Delegate Cherie Sample Hughes in the Eastern Shore, there are seats. And I will tell you, when you look at the governor's map and what he put out, he basically cut the Black caucus in half. So you got to really pay attention. It is a bit more technical. And so you don't have to say, I want this line. That's not really how redistricting works. But you can say the importance of your community being together, the importance to your local officials about representation, right? Those are the things that really need to be communicated. So if I could highlight for our community those top issues, that would be it. And then I have to, of course, it's my committee. So in judiciary, we need some follow-up bills on police reform. For example, my amendment for pensions passed the House, which basically meant if you're an officer and you're found guilty, our state should no longer be paying you your pension. Okay, the Attorney General or your local state attorney can go and get your pension back to the community. Okay. That passed the House. So very proud of the House always. It got cut out in the Senate to negotiate to get the numbers, right? So we're bringing that bill back. So there are things in police reform, and then things that affect our children, like bills like, child interrogation. There's nothing in our law that says a child, parent, guardian, foster parent, anything like that has to be notified when police question a child. All we want is for parents and guardians to be notified when a child is interrogated, and whose children are probably interrogated or talked to by police and the parent doesn't know. Our community and Black and brown communities. And then, finally, which, we're trying to push, is getting rid of felony murder for juveniles. A young kid that drove the car, thought his cousin was just, maybe they're going to steal some stuff, didn't know the cousin in the store was going to murder someone. And now he's just the driver and he's in jail for life. And the guy that actually did the murder is not, because you got to prove the murder case. Felony murder, you don't even have to prove the murder. We should not, it's a bigger debate whether we should have felony murder in general, but definitely not for children. Right. And I think that's something that our community can comprehend. So there are so many bills that affect our community and our children. Honestly, I'm very focused on children disproportionately that we need to be totally addressing. And like Pastor said, not only the digital divide with this digital learning, but access. Because I will tell you, once we get out of this pandemic and the academic difference in our communities, Black and brown communities, with all of this digital learning, it's going to be huge. We passed Blueprint for Maryland's Future, one of our biggest investments. I'm so proud in our public school system, but I am scared that the effect of that won't be there. And then the response will be like, see, it's not investing in our education. The money didn't help. And well, we had a pandemic and kids were digitally learning and it's difficult, right? So I think making sure we're following our legislation around our schools, the budget around our schools, and ensuring that with this pandemic our children can learn is going to be huge in those outcomes. So sorry to be long-winded, but those are the things that I think are super important. And for anyone watching, just go to mdelect.net. It's very short, mdelect.net, put in your address and follow your local elected officials. If you can follow, Hova, who I love Jay-Z, but if you can follow him, you can also follow your state senator on Twitter and Facebook, right? And see what they're posting about and message them. What I tell people all the time, most of us local officials, unless you're like Joe and Kamala and a big senator, that Twitter and Facebook, it's really us. Like, it's really me there's no staff around here. Like, it's really them. And I would say, you've got to care about who's representing your community as much as the sports and the celebrity. And like, and I just would end with, don't think that all of this is a mistake. Why are those things so much more accessible than what's happening in your community? That's what they want to shove you with. They want to shove things that don't matter to you, that don't really end up affecting you, and make it more easily accessible than the things that are. And there's a reason why it's easier to find out those things of interest than to find out what's happening in your community. And so it does take effort. And and to just tie in, we're talking about like the role of the church. And I would say, the church does so much for our community individually, for me spiritually, all of that. And a lot of it is connecting is a huge role of the church, as I see, as the elected official, to connect the congregation to reality, to the people that are in their communities that can help do God's work in all ways. And I just think that is what we really, really need. Because I think as a young person, I'm the youngest Black woman in our state house. It shocks me, my own sorority sisters, my own friends that don't know anything unless I tell them. And it's fine. And I get it. They're dealing with student debt. They're having children. They're getting married. They're living their own lives. But the outcome of their own lives are impacted by what happens in Annapolis and what happens with, student debt is just choking our community. It's choking people in my age range. They can't breathe. They can't do anything. Like, you think the pandemic can't let you breathe? Try the student debt right now. It's just incredible. And so those are the things that I hope and I hope for, and that I want people to pay attention to. Because like I said, I'm going to keep saying it. Black livelihood matters. It just does. And, we can't just be, like you said, Dr. Ray, we can't just be surviving. I want Black Marylanders to thrive. And we have a lot more than others, but we should be the precipice. We should be the goal. And I want to help Maryland get there with all of you. So that would be my response to that.
Look, Reed Temple, state of Maryland, the nation. This is what you get from the assistant majority leader in the House of Delegates in the state of Maryland. You hear all these things that Delegate Fisher is talking about that's so powerful, to speak to statistics that I analyze every single day. The fact that even though we live in a highly affluent, highly educated Black area, when you look at debt between college educated Blacks and whites, it is 7-1. College educated whites have 7 times the amount of wealth of the average college educated Black person. It is not about how much education we have. It's not about how hard we work. There are inequalities built into the system that Delegate Fisher and others are trying to grapple with. So Delegate Fisher, thank you for your service and the work that you're doing. I mean, look, when we start talking about prison sentences and we start talking about drugs, for example, I mean, we could even talk about the differences in sentencing between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Even though it reduced under the Obama administration, it still hasn't went away, with crack being much more likely to be sentenced harshly than cocaine, even though cocaine is the pure drug. But if we talk about cannabis, for example, and marijuana, even though Black people and white people use that drug at similar rates, Black people are much more likely to be charged and incarcerated for it. So these statistics are important for not only how we think about what's happening to our church, but also our local community, and setting a tone for what's happening around the nation, because people are watching Maryland. Accordingly, Dr. Riley, I want to come to you and ask you what you see as the biggest threat to racial justice and an equitable democracy. And I think more importantly, part of what we never do when we pose this question is to talk about, what do we do about that threat? how do we thwart it? How do we address that particular threat? So what do you see as the biggest threat, and what do we do about it?
No, absolutely. And I've been, I think that's a question in my work and in my life that I think can experience daily. I wanted to continue to give some honor to Dr. King. I found a quote, and this quote, I'm going to share it, but I'm also going to help us think about it a little bit differently. He shared a quote that said, people fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they haven't communicated with each other. And the thing that I want to use in this answer for this quote is, I think Black people have communicated. We have used all of our voice, all of our pain, all of our struggles to communicate the right, the human right of justice. And because of systems of inequity, and because we live in a capitalistic society, and because there's this ideology that there's a limited amount of the pie and that we can't make the pie bigger, our communication, our voices have not been heard. I think our biggest threat right now, one, is the fact that if we look at history since the Civil Rights Act, and the Civil Rights Movement, I should say, is that at that point in time, the form of overt racism, it wasn't celebrated. It was you were the minority at that point in time if you engaged in acts that were overtly racist, which caused a lot of the acts of racism to be built into our institutions and systems and become way more covert. Unfortunately, and I know Dr. Ray and other scholars have articulated and researched many implications, including the election of President Obama, the election of Donald Trump, that have now shifted this need to resurface this overt forms of racism. And so not only are we dealing with decades and centuries of systems and institutions like the justice system, like the economy, like education, that have been built on racial inequities and intentionality of disenfranchisement, but we're also now dealing with this resurgence of overt racism, where it is okay to enact policy and to overtly speak racist rhetoric in our society. And that's a dangerous space to be in, because for a lot of generations, including myself, we don't know that space as a common act. We know it in the history books. We know it based off, the practice of our ancestors sharing that with us. But it's not a lived experience that in the aggregate we have experienced in this fight. We have been able to fight really for behind the scenes, covert change and transformation, but we're also now fighting the overt. And so the reality of it is, not only is there the overt and the covert, but the overt forms of racism are being baked into political strategy. It's being baked into why we saw the Stop the Steal campaign. It's being baked into how we're dealing with something as simple as a public health crisis. It's the CRT argument. It's the fight against voting rights that we're experiencing now. And so overt racism has become a strategic effort to not to limit and to get into the space of inclusion, which at one point was celebrated in this country. I think you layer that with the fact that a lot of the term ally is really kind of baked and wrapped in performative and symbolic actions these days. Living here in the DMV, particularly in DC, and participating in some civil unrest during that time and some activism, I could go into the most gentrified parts of Washington, D.C. and see a Black Lives Matter sign on everybody's front door, as if that evoked them as part of this movement. And so folks have needed to feel comfortable with themselves, and they often stop at that point. So not only are we dealing with the resurgence of overt, the more in-depth nature of covert through policies and legislation, we're also not dealing with a strong base of allies and co-conspirators in this work. And so when we think about, and there's many more, again, we have history that we can lean on to teach us how to move through some of these things. But if we think about solutions, one, I think those of us who have the privilege to understand the importance of civic engagement beyond voting have to demystify the involvement of civic engagement beyond the participation of presidential elections, and even beyond maybe the participation in local and state elections. That civic engagement requires the ability to volunteer and engage and give of your time. That's a privilege. That's a privilege that we often take for granted for those of us who don't have to be concerned about how we're feeding our families, how we're paying our bills, our safety. And so we have to demystify and make that more accessible. I think the most important thing now is for Black folks have to be educated about the strategies of covert and overt racism and how they're built in to a lot of our systems. And it doesn't need to be scholarly. It doesn't take 3 doctors and honorable elected official to talk about it. We have to make it so it's accessible to everyone. I think the church plays a huge role in that. The church is an organizer. It is a space not only where you can be organized and move issues forward, but where you also can be fed. Because another thing that we're dealing with is, in the midst of all this, our mental health and our wellness. This is heavy work, and the church provides a space for folks to be able to be fed and to be able to be healed in the time of these actions. And so, I think, again, I would say to solve, we have to demystify civic engagement. We do need to be engaged civically. We need to demystify running for office. I'll be completely honest. It was a goal I had in my younger days. I was intimidated by it. Even hearing Delegate Fisher talk about the different legalities in legislation, and as someone who's doing advocacy and policy work, I'm still intimidated to be able to do that work. And so I think we have to make it more accessible to Black folks. And then I think those of us that are doing the work and have the opportunity to speak on panels, there's a term I always live my life by, is you have to be of and in the community. And what I mean by that is it's good to be able to get on panels and talk about this, but if you are only pontificating about the issues and you're not directly connected to the communities, you're not in the space, you're not experiencing or have not experienced and don't have direct linkage, then I think some of our efforts are going to be seen unauthentic and performative as well. So we have to think about how those of us who are moving this movement stay in and of the communities and stay connected in an authentic and positive and transformational way. So those are some initial thoughts that I have. I mean, many more, but I think those are the things most important that I think we have to think, particularly as we get into midterms and we get into some very heavy policy debates that we're in right now, both at the state and federal level. Those are some things we need to push up and make priorities.
Dr. Riley, that MLK quote and talking about co-conspirators, what I oftentimes call racial equity allies and advocates, right, is so important. I want to do a quick round robin as we end, because I know everyone is running to different places. Delegate Fisher, I'm going to start with you, go to Dr. Riley, and then end with the pastor for an ending word here. Is what gives you faith and hope to stay optimistic and motivated for change?
That's a really hard round robin to be short, but I think what gives me faith and hope is obviously my faith and like the ultimate sacrifices that Jesus made for me. And so there's nothing I'm doing that's at that level. And then, so I think that's where I anchor myself, because politics, we could have a whole Zoom about politics and how challenging it is personally, mentally, the things I've just experienced. And the other thing that gives me faith is honestly my family and my family history. I just think about my grandfather in South Africa dealing with apartheid, organizing, just the things my mom experienced with her card, her race, her zone, her travel times. And then my uncle, my mom's brother, subsequently was killed by white police, and then they fled. And I just think about that, like, I don't know, my grandfather passed before I won my election. And I think about him a lot, just going from, organizing in South Africa to like voting for Barack Obama to like his granddaughter's name is on the board where they used to sell slaves like 200 feet away. And he didn't see the end of it, but he saw all of it. I mean, he took me to all my little debates because my parents were working all the time. So he drove me to all my little SGA debates and mock trial and just all of that stuff. And I still at this day don't know everything my grandfather went through or all his stories. He's a very kind of closed man, not a very I love you guy. But I just think about him a lot and my grandmother a lot and just everything they went through to get us here. And so nothing that I'm facing in Annapolis or in politics is as challenging as kind of the things that led me here. And, ultimately what has been sacrificed for me, not only by Jesus himself, but God and all of those things. So I think about that because politics is not for the faint-hearted, and it is really tough. And I was, in a more female setting, I was talking to young women that are interested, and it is hard. And there are things I wish I knew, and I didn't know I was going to sacrifice so much my personal time, even at a local level, and like nobody knows who you are. It is really, we're all not Kamalas and Hillarys and that kind of level. And I just really and I think it's a journey, and I'm learning to have forgiveness and grace and empathy for myself. I think I've been on a personal journey, definitely, in learning how to re-love myself constantly, and also knowing that my biggest love story and journey is like the love I have with Jesus and my faith, and also the love and being in love with Wanika. And that is hard, especially more for women as well, is putting that love story above anything else. And that's something I'm working on, and I'm not fully there yet, but at least I know in my mind I have to be focused on that. And that's what keeps me going and keeps me inspired. And like, I just can't believe there's just nothing to improve and that's it. And this is our lot in life. And oh, well, I can't do that. So, that's what I would say to people watching this call. And like, just to know, if anything, you didn't hear anything today, just know that you are enough. You're enough, and you're the leader and change you're waiting for. It's not any of us on this panel. It's not me. You're enough. And to put yourself out there and give your community and your children a voice. And I think a lot of things in society constantly tell you you're not enough. And I would just say that you are.
Delegate Wanika Fisher, look, I think many people at Reed knew who you were. Many people probably live in your district. But for those who didn't, Wanika Fisher, remember the name. I don't think people will forget. Thank you for your time. Dr. Riley, what gives you faith and hope to keep you optimistic and motivated during these times?
A lot of similar to what Delegate Fisher said, and I'll just add the idea of I daydream and think about Black people being liberated. And it is a kind of like a phenomenological concept. It seems unreal, even for those of us who have achieved some of the quote unquote potentials of this democracy. But the idea that Black people, there is a way and a strategy that will allow us to breathe and exhale and just be is worth any sacrifice. And then I think the last thing is just, again, the Sankofa concept. I mean, our ancestors were bound, shackled, and were property. The least I can do is risk my comfortability to create a better tomorrow, knowing that I may not see it. But again, I think that's all grounded in the idea of liberation and wanting there to be a day where Black people can excel and be and live and feel whole is enough motivation for me.
The least I can do is risk my comfortability, given what everyone has done before. Dr. Riley, so well put. Pastor, take us out, Dr. Yeri. What keeps you motivated? What keeps you optimistic to have faith and hope during this time?
Well, again, to Pastor Mark Whitlock and the good people at Reed Temple Church, I owe a deep debt of gratitude to all of you for an opportunity to share. And Pastor Whitlock was actually one of the lecturers the summer I went to the Summer Leadership Institute at Harvard Divinity School. So his work predates his coming to the Second Episcopal District, where you all have a tremendous leader in Bishop James Davis. And so, I'm still AME true and true. So we can call the roll and talk about annual conference at another time. Let me just say that this question about liberation is internal first. It yields external results. And here's what I mean. On this screen is evidence that we can navigate successfully white spaces. All you got to do is look at the bios of anybody on this screen, and somewhere along the line, you're going to see where we have had to prove ourselves in predominantly white institutions, in spaces that are created for us. I'm not sure where Dr. Riley is on today, because I know he got training in Athens, and then he did administrative time at the University of Alabama. So I'm not sure where he is after the national team. Okay, go Dogs. I just wanted to make sure, because I was born in Augusta. I was going to make sure you came correct. Otherwise, we were going to have a problem. As Delegate Fisher gets ready to go in and lead in a legislative session, having graduated from Penn State Law, is that right? Coming from family dynamics that tell the story, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Dr. Ray, University of Indiana trained. Indiana, think about it, the state where the Klan was born. And here you come with your funny hairstyle and your creative genius and your willingness to look at issues of justice and equity and put it in front of a crowd of folks who are only supposed to look to Jesus to take us to heaven. At the end of the day, the question of liberation has to be first internal. It starts with the seeking to make the conditions of our future better. Even if our conditions never change, we have a debt and obligation to do what we often call pay it forward. I would say as we get ready to part company today and think about the work of Dr. King, remember, he was assassinated at 39 years old. Reverend Jackson never thought he'd live past 39. That became the benchmark of survivability for folks who were about freedom, justice, and equity. Reverend Jackson is now 80. Andy Young, the ambassador and the mayor, is into his 80s. We have inherited a resilience that we have to use in this moment to make sure that the justice, not for just ourselves and our kids, but for our children's 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 children, begins to take shape and form today. Now, I want to say this before Delegate Fisher leaves, because having a connection by South African lineage, understanding how apartheid was actually dismantled, we look at it with the release of the late President Nelson Mandela, but it actually started at about the same time the Montgomery bus boycott was going on. There was a Freedom Congress in the mid-1950s where the Freedom Charter was actually adopted by those who were pushing back against the governmental system. That became the framework for what is now the South African Constitution. It was decades later. And so what we're doing today may not be for today. What we're doing today may be about some tomorrow that we'll never see, to Dr. Riley's point. And so if I were to sum it up in this moment, we've got to make sure that we have the right focus for the right effort, always pushing for the right outcome, recognizing that progress is never perfect, but it always moves us forward. And so the quote I will leave for us today is not from Dr. King, but from the one who is largely spoken of as the one who mentored him, particularly in his days at Morehouse, when Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays was the president. There's a quote from Dr. Mays that is the other thing that kind of keeps me focused about what my effort ought to be. And I just want to read it as we get ready to part. Dr. Mays wrote, "It must be borne in mind that the tragedy of life doesn't lie in not reaching your goal. The tragedy lies in having no goal to reach. It isn't a calamity to die with dreams unfulfilled, but it is a calamity not to dream. It is not a disaster to be unable to capture your ideal, but it is a disaster to have no ideal to capture. It is not a disgrace not to reach the stars, but it is a disgrace to have no stars to reach for. Not failure, but low aim is sin. Let us not be guilty of sin in this moment, but let's make sure that we make the tomorrows brighter for the generations yet unborn." Dr. Ray, thank you for this wonderful time with these wonderful people. I've been richly blessed, and I pray that I'll see you on the battlefield for our Lord, because I promised him that I would serve him till I die. Come on, y'all. I'm on the battlefield for my Lord.
All right.
Pastor, that was amazing. I mean, look, you all are miraculous in so many ways. I knew that you all would be great together, giving people what they need to be fed on this day. And as we close out, 2 MLK quotes that I always think about when I think about faith and hope. First, we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. I think that speaks to this moment, as we oftentimes feel that what we're doing is not mattering, but it does. And as Dr. Riley said, we might not see it, but it matters for the next generation, for the little people that we look at. And MLK also said, faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. I continuously use that quote throughout my life when I know God is ordering my steps to go somewhere. I can't see through the clouds, but I know I can look down and see that next step. And as long as I follow that, I know that God will lead my path forward. So look, on this MLK holiday weekend, we thank everyone for tuning in, to Delegate Fisher, to Dr. Riley, to Pastor Dr. Yeary. We really appreciate everyone, as well as the people who helped put this event together. On behalf of Dr. Whitlock, Pastor Whitlock, and everyone else in terms of bringing this event together, on behalf of the Public Policy Institute at Reed Temple AME Church, we thank you for tuning in, and we appreciate you being here with us.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest drink, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. When darkness veils His loving face, I rest on His unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale,